They came back after dark. Lord Chelmsford's column returned to the camp at Isandlwana sometime after 10 o'clock at night, and the first thing they noticed was the silence. No sentries called out, no fires burned. The moon had set, and the men couldn't see clearly. They stumbled. Some of them fell. And when the torches finally came up, they understood why. 1,200 men were dead across the ground they were walking on. Chelmsford ordered his column to bed down for the night. The soldiers lay on the earth in the dark, among the bodies of the force they hadn't been there to protect. From somewhere in the hills there were sounds, distant, uncertain. Nobody knew if the Zulu army would come back. The camp at Isandlwana had carried 400,000 rounds of ammunition, 2 artillery pieces, 6 companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot, some of the most experienced infantry in the British Empire, and every man was dead. There was no wagon laager, no earthworks, no trenches. In a country the British had invaded 11 days earlier, the camp at the base of the mountain had no defences at all. Chelmsford had been warned. He'd been told the main Zulu army was nearby. He left anyway, and what he came back to, what his soldiers slept beside that night, was the largest British military defeat of the 19th century. The question is how a camp with 400 Susan rounds and the best rifles in the world ended up as a field of bodies before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The answer starts, as most imperial disasters do, with a man in an office making a decision nobody had authorised him to make. Sir Henry Bartle Frere was the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, and in the late 1870s he had a plan. He wanted to unite the British colonies of Southern Africa into a single confederation, a consolidated imperial structure that would be cheaper to administer and easier to defend. The Zulu kingdom, under King Cetshwayo Kampande, stood in the way, not because Cetshwayo was threatening anyone. He wasn't. His explicit standing orders were that Zulu warriors were not to cross into British Natal. His strategy was defensive. But he commanded the most disciplined African army south of the Sahara, and Frere wanted it gone. In December 1878, Frere delivered an ultimatum to Cetshwayo at the lower Tugela River. The demands included the disbandment of the Zulu military system, the Amabutho, the regiment structure that had organised Zulu society for generations. Most historians who have studied the diplomatic record consider the terms to have been deliberately impossible. You don't ask a sovereign king to dissolve his country's entire military foundation and expect a yes. Cetshwayo, who had worked for years to maintain a diplomatic relationship with the British, had no path to compliance that did not amount to the dissolution of his own kingdom. Frere gave him 30 days. The British cabinet in London hadn't been consulted. By the time word reached London that the ultimatum had been delivered, it was too late to stop it. 3 British columns crossed into Zululand in January 1879. The number 3 column, under Lord Chelmsford himself, marched toward the centre of Zululand and made camp at the base of a distinctive sphinx-shaped mountain. The local name for it was Isandlwana. Chelmsford's standing orders for forces operating in hostile territory required entrenchment. A wagon laager, the wagon circled as a defensive perimeter, was standard practice in southern African warfare. The Boers used it habitually. It was well established, and when Chelmsford's officers raised the question at Isandlwana, he reportedly said it wasn't worthwhile. The ground was hard, coal-bearing shale, difficult to dig. But wagons were available. The wagons were parked, not circled. The tents went up by regiment across a wide open area that assumed no attack would come. Chelmsford believed his firepower was sufficient. The Martini-Henry rifle, the artillery, the 400,000 rounds, and that British infantry didn't need walls. He believed the Zulu wouldn't dare attack a prepared British position. A fortified camp would have presented a very different tactical problem. What he left behind was not fortified. On the morning of January 22, 1879, Chelmsford received reports of a Zulu presence to the southeast. He took roughly half his force, around 500 men, and marched out to engage it. He left the camp under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline, an experienced administrator with limited field command experience. Pauline's orders were simple: defend the camp. Pauline was at his desk by 8 o'clock that morning when the first report came in. Zulu forces were visible, advancing from the left front of the camp. He dictated a message to Chelmsford's staff officer. The text survived. Staff officer, report just come in that Zulus are advancing in force from the left front of the camp. 8:05 a.m, HB Pauline, Lieutenant Cole. The message reached Chelmsford's staff around 9:30. Chelmsford kept marching. Around 10:30, Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived at the camp with his mounted column. Durnford was technically senior to Pauline, which made the command situation immediately complicated. He didn't formally assume overall command. He and Pauline held different orders and different instincts. Pauline wanted to hold the perimeter. Durnford wanted to ride out and engage the Zulu threat before it reached the camp. They didn't resolve it. Durnford rode out with his mounted troops toward the Nkutu Plateau to the northeast. Pauline had to stretch his defensive line to cover the gap that created. By late morning, the British firing line extended over a mile from the supply wagons, across open ground that a runner would have to cross under fire to deliver ammunition. At some point during the battle, Chelmsford sent word ordering the camp to be struck and the force to march out to join him. Pauline's response, his last recorded message, read, "Heavy firing to left of our camp. Cannot move camp at present." He was already fighting for his life. The order could not be obeyed. 400,000 rounds sat in those wagons. The question of whether they could reach the men who needed them was about to become the most important question of the afternoon. 5 miles northeast of the camp, in a valley carved into the plateau, 20,000 Zulu warriors had been sitting in silence since the previous night. The Ngwebeni Valley was deep enough to conceal an entire army. The Impi, the main Zulu force, had been positioned there for days, disciplined and waiting. The original plan was to remain hidden until January 23. Some accounts suggest there was a reluctance to attack during the solar eclipse that was coming. The Zulu called it the Day of the Dead Moon, and some warriors saw it as inauspicious. But at around 11 o'clock on the morning of January 22, a British patrol crested the ridge above the valley. They were looking for cattle. They looked down and saw the valley floor covered with warriors. The Impi had been found. It rose the Zulu tactical formation. The Impondo Zankomo, the horns of the buffalo, was a planned, rehearsed maneuver, not a charge. The chest of the formation would press forward and pin the enemy's front. The left and right horns would sweep wide around the flanks. The loins, the reserve, would hold back until needed. Against a concentrated, fortified position, it would have been a harder problem. Against a firing line stretched a mile from its own ammunition, spread thin across open ground with no fallback, it functioned as a closing trap. The advance began at a walk. It reached the British line faster than the extended companies could contract. The Martini-Henry performed exactly as designed. In the early minutes of the battle, the volley fire was devastating. Zulu accounts describe the impact of that first contact. Regiments taking horrific casualties approaching the line, falling in numbers that shocked even their own commanders. The British infantry didn't panic. They held their position and fired. One Zulu veteran, recorded decades later, said those red soldiers at Isandlwana, how few they were and how they fought. They fell like stones, each man in his place. But the ammunition runners were already falling behind. The popular version of the ammunition problem is that the wooden boxes were screwed shut and quartermasters refused to issue rounds without proper paperwork. There's some truth in the details. The boxes were difficult to open quickly, and at least some quartermasters hesitated at the chaos of informal requisition. Smith Dorrien, one of the transport officers, described the confusion in his account. But the evidence doesn't support a systematic refusal as the primary cause. The real problem was distance. The line was over a mile from the wagons. Runners carrying ammunition boxes across open ground, under fire, couldn't keep pace with the rate of consumption on a fighting line pressing back 20,000 warriors. The existing supply system could not cope with the gap the extended line had created. 400,000 rounds were in that camp. The men on the line ran out anyway, standing alongside the British regulars, armed with spears and cowhide shields, were the soldiers of the Natal native contingent. Only around 10% of the NNC had been issued firearms. The rest were expected to hold part of the line against the same force that was requiring rifle volleys to slow down. The Zulu right horn reached the rear of the camp. The firing line was no longer a line. What followed wasn't the famous painting. Charles Fripp's last stand at Isandlwana, a cohesive British square standing back-to-back in perfect formation, became the preferred image of the battle for a century. It's probably fiction. Archaeological surveys and historical accounts together describe something more fragmented and more final. Isolated groups of men, separated from each other as the encirclement closed, making their own last stands on different parts of the slope. Stone cairns mark those places today. Each one sits where a cluster of men fought and died alone. Captain Younghusband's company made their stand under the southern crag of the mountain. Roughly 70 men of the 24th were found where the main monument stands now. Others died in the dongas, the dry gullies cutting across the hillside, or along the fugitives' trail leading toward the Buffalo River. During the final collapse, the sky darkened. The annular solar eclipse reached somewhere between 65 and 75% obscuration that afternoon, dimming the sun over the battlefield. The Zulu called it the Day of the Dead Moon. Warriors later described the ancestors watching. 2 officers, Lieutenants Tainmath Melville and Neville Coghill, rode for the Buffalo River carrying the Queen's colour, the regimental flag, rather than leave it to be taken. They crossed the river. They were killed on the far bank. The colour was lost in the water and recovered 12 days later. In 1907, both men were posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, among the first ever given posthumously. Colonel Durnford's body was found at the camp perimeter. He'd fallen back from his forward position and died there among his men. He did not flee. Fewer than 60 Europeans survived the battle. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Isandlwana was over. The Court of Enquiry convened in February 1879. It produced no formal verdict. No one was court-martialed. The most senior officer present at the camp was dead, which meant the most convenient outcome was available. Chelmsford's staff directed blame toward Durnford. He'd ridden out against orders, they said. He'd left the camp exposed. He'd failed to maintain the defensive perimeter. Durnford couldn't testify. He was in the ground at Isandlwana. Chelmsford retained his command. He went on to defeat the Zulu at Ulundi in July 1879, which gave him the face-saving victory he needed to return home as something other than the man who lost fain 300 soldiers in an afternoon. His army burned Cetshwayo's capital. The Zulu kingdom, which had just won the greatest military victory of any indigenous African nation against a European colonial power, was destroyed within 6 months. Cetshwayo, the king who had tried for years to avoid exactly this war, who had sent his army into the field with orders not to cross into British territory, was captured, transported to London, and eventually returned to a Zululand that had been divided between British-installed rivals. He died in 1884 under disputed circumstances. He had won the greatest military victory against a European colonial power of any southern African nation, and it did not save his kingdom by a single year. Frere, the man whose ultimatum started it, was eventually recalled and formally censured by the British government. He was never punished. He faced no criminal consequence for a war that killed over 1,000 of his own country's soldiers and dismantled an entire kingdom. Durnford's brother Edward spent years publishing his own defence, collecting affidavits, challenging Chelmsford's account publicly. The family campaign lasted decades. The accusation that destroyed Anthony Durnford's reputation, that he failed to defend the camp, was a precise description of the decision Chelmsford himself had made weeks earlier when he called the laager not worthwhile. The Zulu perspective was never formally solicited. No Zulu commander was interviewed by the Court of Enquiry. The greatest military victory of any southern African nation was recorded entirely through the voices of the side that lost. Now return to the number. The title says 300 British soldiers. The casualty records say something more complicated. One commonly cited framework puts the total at roughly 1,329 dead. Of those, approximately 858 were Europeans. 52 officers and around 806 NCOs and enlisted men, primarily from the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 24th Regiment, with artillery detachments and support personnel included. The remaining dead, somewhere in the range of 471, were local auxiliaries, colonial volunteers from the Natal Carbineers, the Buffalo Border Guard, and the Newcastle Mounted Rifles, along with the men of the Natal Native Contingent and civilian transport workers whose names were rarely separated out at all. And then there were the men of the Natal Native Contingent. Estimates of NNC dead specifically range from more than 300 to close to 471, depending on the source, because the records themselves are inconsistent. These men were not considered worth the same administrative attention as British regulars. The surviving rolls are uneven and incomplete. Roughly a third of the dead at Isandlwana were not British regular soldiers at all, and the largest group within that third were African men who had been given spears and shields and asked to stand beside rifle companies against 20,000 Zulu warriors. The colonial narrative called them cowards who bolted. The evidence, such as it is, suggests many of them fought until they were physically overwhelmed. They had no other option. They had almost no weapons. For over a century, the memorials at Isandlwana commemorated the British dead. It wasn't until 1999 that a monument to the Zulu dead was erected. The NNC dead remained largely unrecognised. Their names were never properly recorded. Their number is still uncertain. The Zulu themselves paid an enormous price for their victory. Estimates of Zulu dead range from 1,000 to 3,000. They won the battle. They lost the kingdom. The documentary's debate question has two honest sides. Was Lord Chelmsford right to retain command after Isandlwana? One argument holds that removing a general in the field mid-campaign creates chaos, that Chelmsford knew the theatre, and that he ultimately won at Ulundi, which the Empire needed. The failure at Isandlwana, under this reading, was partly the result of decisions made by subordinates he wasn't there to supervise. The other argument holds that he refused the laager, split the force, ignored Pulain's warnings, and then blamed a dead man for the consequences. A commander who causes a catastrophe through his own documented decisions and then shifts responsibility to officers who cannot speak for themselves has done something that goes beyond military failure. But the companion question may carry more weight. If the empire that started this war couldn't remember all its dead equally, if hundreds of NNC men were erased from the memorials for over a century while their officers received Victoria Crosses, what does that say about the justice of the enterprise? The empire commemorated its symbols, it manufactured its scapegoats, and the men who had the least power to object to any of it were the ones whose count the surviving records never fully agreed on. The number on the screen when this started was 1,300. The actual number is still uncertain, and that uncertainty, the fact that the records themselves were never made consistent, may be the most honest thing this story has to tell. If this history is worth your time, consider subscribing and drop a comment with where you're watching from.